I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Bundjalung land on which I am giving this presentation today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge that this land, which I benefit from occupying, was stolen, and that sovereignty was never ceded by the Bundjalung people. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a humble brag. I just moved to Australia's Gold Coast, which you might remember from when Tom Hanks got COVID-19 about 4 million years ago. Anyway, we've moved to a relatively nice area with a whole lot of development going on. Most of these big development sites have advertising up around the construction, enticing people to come and buy an apartment or two. And I've noticed that they all have a few things in common. They all have a stupid aspirational name like Esperance or Athena or Delta, which they're possibly regretting. And they all say something about architecture. Architecturally designed, says one. The best elements of architectural design, says another. So let's have a think about what architecture means in this sense. Clearly, the developers of these properties are relying on you thinking that having an architect design your home makes it a bit fancier. When in reality, most of these projects are apartment buildings, and having lived in a few, I can tell you that most are just tiny boxes stacked on top of one another. But if we dig past the marketing words, we know that an architect is the person who designs the building. They don't choose the location, go out and buy the materials, or do any kind of building, plumbing, or electrical work. They don't choose which furniture to put in the home, what the kitchen cabinets look like, or pick the carpet. They are purely about design. Picking the shape of the house, the layout of the rooms, making sure it suits the area it's in and the people who live in it, and hopefully getting a spot on Grand Designs or something. So can you have a home that hasn't had an architect? Well, one of my guiltier internet pleasures is to browse bad real estate photos. And the way I see it is that these are the result of homes that haven't had the benefit of an architect. Or maybe had an architect involved so long ago that the architect wore mission brown flares and a peace sign necklace. In most of these atrocities, you'll notice that the fixtures and fittings are often quite nice, like this perfectly reasonable bathtub, or this actually quite lovely chandelier. The thing that's gone wrong is not the construction or the furniture or anything like that, it's the design. So to bring this around the long way to documentation, you can think of the words you write as being like these kitchen drawers. Perfectly good wood cabinetry, nice chrome handles. If only they'd designed them in a way that they could actually be used. And that's what this talk is really about. I know you already know how to write great words in the best order. I'm certain you can craft a procedure that makes grown adults weep with its elegant simplicity, and I just know that you can come up with the perfect title for every manual every time. But none of that matters if you don't have an architect involved. If you are starting from a completely blank slate, then you can probably skip this step. But I'm betting that most of you already have something written down. Whether it's new content or older than time itself, the best way to work out what you need is to make a critical assessment of what you already have. Even if what you have is the carpeted toilet of technical documentation. This process works equally well if you're new to the content and need to wrap your head around it, or if you're a bit too familiar with it and you need to try and see it with fresh eyes. The best way I've found to start with this long, hard look at your content is to create a content map. How you do this depends largely on how much content you have. If you have a few hundred pages, or if you don't want to go too deep into your hierarchy, then you can probably just create a table in a document. If you have, say, a giant wiki that you're trying to categorize, start with a spreadsheet. You could potentially go the whole hog and set up a database if you really want to spend time on this, but in most cases that would probably be overkill. This is a content map I did when I started my current job. And if we zoom in on the first page, you can see I've only looked at the top 3 levels of the hierarchy, at least partly because that's where the bulk of the content was. So we have the top level, second level, and third level or page title, a URL to the page, and the general content type of that page. Now I'm going to come back to content types in a minute. For now though, you can already see patterns starting to form just by zooming out. We have one huge top level bucket that contains most of the content. And while the second level headings are more evenly spaced, there's still one that's much bigger than the others. You can also see that the smaller top level headings don't have a second level heading. Most of the content sits higher in the hierarchy than in our big top level bucket. So that's something we'll need to come back and look at. Now, content types are something that probably most of you have come across, and there are several different ways of categorizing content, but my favorite one is the DITA, D-I-T-A model. And that's mostly because it's the simplest to understand and to explain. Basically, there are 3 different content types: concepts, tasks, and reference. If the content answers the question, what is it? Then it's a concept. Concepts are usually prose paragraphs that explain what something is or how something works. If the content answers the question, how do I do it? Then it's a task. These are usually numbered steps in the form of procedures. And then if it answers the question, what else do I need to know? It's a reference. This is usually a table or a list of things that you can look up to find out information, such as what a particular command does or a list of options. Now, good documentation should have clearly defined sections of concepts, followed by tasks, followed by reference. And you can start to see at a glance now where my biggest issue was. Most of the content I had was mixed. It had concepts interwoven with tasks, and tasks followed by more tasks without any concepts at all, and very little reference content. This is a massive red flag. Beginners need lots of concepts, and experienced users need to be able to skip the concepts and easily locate tasks and reference information. When it's all mixed up, it just becomes difficult for everyone. So now that you have a content map drawn up, and you can already start seeing some of your initial problems, you need to turn around from your content and have a look at what's on the other side, your readers. The first thing to do is to really think hard about who is reading your docs. The simple answer to that is, of course, our users, but that's actually a bit of a cop-out. There's a reason that most technical writers use the term readers rather than users for the people who use the product we create. It's because users use software and readers read documentation. And while that Venn diagram overlaps, it's not a perfect circle. Your readers are not always, or sometimes not even mainly, your users. Depending on your product, you may find that sales and support staff use your docs more than end users do, which is the case in many professional contexts. In the open source world, you probably find that people read your docs to determine if they want to be involved in your community, or if they want to use your product in their own project, or if they might want to fork your project for some reason. These readers cannot necessarily be considered users, and it's important that we write documentation that's appropriate for them as well. Now, I'm going to tell you a secret. Absolutely no one curls up at night with a warm drink and a great technical manual. If that's the case, why do people read docs? Generally speaking, it's because they want to achieve something. To put that in less abstract terms, you need to work out what problem your reader is trying to solve. There's a common quote that says something like, people don't buy a drill because they need a drill, they buy a drill because they need a hole. When it comes to documentation, you actually need to go a step further and ask why they need the hole. So let's say my friend Alex is at the local hardware store looking at drills. What kind of advice would help here? There's a pretty good chance that when Alex woke up this morning, they didn't think, you know what? I don't have a drill. I should go to the hardware store today and buy one. What is more likely is that they woke up this morning and thought something like, oh, I should hang that picture on my office wall, or I should install a bed over the staircase. So the content that Alex needs is probably not called how to choose a drill. The documentation they need is how to install beds in unconventional places. This is an important distinction, because if you get it wrong, your readers won't know if the content is right for them, or worse, they won't find your content at all. Now, it's really easy to sit around and have a think about who your readers might be, but it's even better if you can go out and find out for real. This isn't always going to be an option for you, depending on how much time you have available. So I would definitely recommend that you do as much of this as you possibly can, but don't beat yourself up if you simply don't have the bandwidth to do it all. The main thing is to try and get in contact with your readers in any way you can. My preferred method is to start with a series of one-on-one interviews with people you already know. If you have a community around your product or company, you can usually reach out to your top contributors and users pretty easily. If you're in a larger corporate environment, I would start with sales, technical account managers, and consulting staff. You can then use the information you get from these interviews to create a short survey to send out to your wider audience, if that option's available to you. This research serves a couple of different purposes. The first reason is that you get direct feedback on your current docs. There's a good chance you'll find out some truth about your docs, but it's even more likely that you'll have some suspicions confirmed about the pain points. And that's great, because now you have data to back up why you're making changes, and you have a much better story to tell about the improvements. But the second reason is more long-term. You might not get any advantage immediately, but in the weeks and months to come, when someone notices a problem with a document, they're more likely to think, hold on, someone was asking about this recently, who was that? So it actually builds engagement in the long term. It's also really important to understand what your readers actually want, rather than what you think they might want. In my previous role, the developers kept telling us that we needed more quick start information. But when we asked our readers, they all said they wanted more explanations of how things worked, not just step-by-step procedures. Both of those are about getting started, sure, but in terms of the content we needed to write, they are very different. By the same token, you also need to find out if readers actually want what they say they want. One piece of feedback I got once from a reader was to stop moving things around. And this was super interesting, because when I dug deeper into the problem, it turned out that people found the documentation so difficult to navigate that they were saving hard links to the content they needed. So if we moved things, those hard links broke. The problem was not that we were moving things around, but they couldn't find stuff in the first place. In the end, the solution to that was to improve the navigability of the site, implement a really good site search mechanism, and to get more consistency in our section headings and procedure titles. So in the end, the way to fix the problem of moving things around was to move things around. A lot of technical writers like to do a user task analysis to work out what content needs to be prioritized. You can spend a lot of time on these to do them properly, but you don't really go into too much detail. It's really just a way to validate what you probably already have in your head by now. To do this, you need to have an idea of who your readers are and the things your readers want to describe. The lists don't need to be exhaustive, but you should be able to group most of them into some broad categories that cover the spectrum of readers and tasks. So looking at the reader types first, the way you categorize them is up to you, but sometimes the best way to start is to think of a beginner, an intermediate reader, and an expert. Or, depending on the kind of product you have, you might think of an ordinary user, a system administrator, and a support person. Your 3 readers should probably be interested in different parts of your product. They will be trying to do different tasks, and they will need different levels of help from your docs. Don't be afraid to let them overlap a little bit, but try and make sure you've covered at least most of the options. So in the example I'm about to show you, I'm using system admins, sales, and support, but you could easily include developers, hobbyists, executives, or any number of others. So now you need to have a think about what your readers are trying to achieve. For each of your readers, start by thinking about how they might begin. What's the very first thing they want to do? Let's assume that they managed to complete that without any trouble. What's the second thing that they want to do? And now they've done that, what's the next thing? Again, you don't need to be exhaustive here, but make sure you cover the big ticket items, things like installing, configuring, troubleshooting, that kind of thing. So once you have those things, you can put them in a little table and work out how likely it is that a particular reader will use the documentation to do each task. So if you put the reader types across the top of your table and all the tasks down the side, you get a great matrix that looks something like this. Obviously, this is only the first few lines, but it should give you the idea. You can fill out each square on the table with the likelihood that each reader type will use the docs to do each task. Note the really important thing here. You're not asking if system administrators are likely to do a product installation because, of course, they are. You're asking if system admins are likely to use the documentation to do a product installation. The answer to that is trickier, and it depends on things like how easy your product is to install and how often a system admin does that task. When you have all the boxes filled out, you can do some simple maths. Score a 3 for high likelihood, 2 for medium, and 1 for low, and that gives each task a score. The higher the number, the more critical the documentation for this task is. So in the example here, you can see that product research scores a 6 because it's only really important to one group, but managing clients scores a 9 because it's important to everyone. That means we know we need to spend more time and effort on documenting how to manage clients, and we can improve the general product info later on. The highest scoring things in your table are referred to as critical paths. The items with the highest critical path score is the content that's most important for you to write. All this doesn't mean that the lower ranked things aren't important, of course, but now you know where to focus. If you find that your focus points are not adequately covered in your existing docs, then you have an immediate start point. By now, you know what content you have a pretty good idea of who your readers are and what kind of content they need. So now we can take a look at the structure of the docs and work out if the way things are organized now matches what our readers want. Now, generally speaking, humans have a tendency to put things in hierarchies. So you will probably be facing a documentation suite that looks a little bit like this. Unfortunately, hierarchies like this work well for when we have a bunch of things and we need to organize them, but they don't actually work very well for when we need to find something. To demonstrate, think about when you last moved house. Having done this just recently, I can tell you that what I did when I got to the new place was to start unpacking boxes and boxes of stuff. So you pick up one thing and you put it somewhere that seems reasonable, and then days later you wander around trying to find it. I have 2 cats, and I ended up worming them both a full week late this month because I found one cat's medicine in one place and the other cat's medicine somewhere completely different after I'd been hunting for it for 3 days. So putting things in a reasonable place is a very different skill and uses a different part of your brain to finding things. To get this back to documentation, you need to think about the different methods people use to find your content. Are they coming to you directly, or are they typing docs.yourcompany.com into their search? Or are they just searching your company docs, or maybe how do I install the thing, or even what is the thing? When they reach your page, what page are they landing on? Is it the top level page of your hierarchy, or some page deep in the content? And then, perhaps the most important question, where do they go next? Do they search for something else on your site? Do they use a navigation menu to click on something else? Or do they get bored and click away to Facebook? One of the most important things I noticed when I was analysing the docs at Timescale was that we had several methods of navigating the docs, but they all relied on readers already knowing what they were looking for. This would be fine if we were catering only to experienced readers, but we knew from research that we had a lot of brand new beginner readers, and we had a lot of content tailored directly to new readers in the form of tutorials and getting started information, so we needed to make sure our new readers could find it. Because our product has quite a few unique terms for features, it was doubly important that we didn't just assume that readers knew what those terms were or what they meant. We needed to develop a way of navigating that not only allowed people to find content they knew they needed, but that could lead them to content they didn't know they needed. Basically, we wanted to guide readers from a place of understanding, or I need to know how to do this thing, to a place of discovery, or I didn't know it could do this other thing. This is an important distinction because often readers know what they want to achieve, but they don't know the words to describe that thing, or they might use different words to what we use. From here, we get to a step that I like to call using your thinking brain. Hopefully, the analysis you've done so far has led you to some natural conclusions that are now just waiting for you to express them fully. But even if you're more confused than ever, you can start methodically working through some ideas. How do you need to arrange your content to make it easier for your readers to achieve their goals? What technologies do you have available in terms of automation and organization? In my current role, we decided to significantly flatten our hierarchy and implement some intelligence in the form of keywords and related content. Whatever your thinking brain has come up with, it's time to write all your brilliant ideas down. Even if they're incredibly unrealistic, write them down anyway. We'll work on cutting them down to size the next step. So this step is what I call an implementation plan, and it's where reality settles back in and we decide what's actually feasible and in what time frame. This is the point where it's really important that you have some management buy-in on your overall plan. So you might want to make sure you've shopped your initial research around the company a bit so that this doesn't all come out of the blue for your manager. The first thing to do is to work out what resources you have. That's people, time, and money. These work in the form of a project management constraint triangle. If you don't have much time, you'll need more people to do the work and more money to cover things like outsourced contractors or ready-made software or tools. If you don't have a lot of money, you can compensate by having more people to do the work and expecting it to take longer. If you don't have a lot of people, you'll need more time and money. The next step is to determine what your minimum viable product is. That's your starting point. The smallest piece of work that can be done to achieve some benefit. In most projects, this is usually a small reorganization of existing content or adding a small feature, such as site search. From there, you can work out what the next level items are. More features, more automation, better metadata for SEO, improved content, right up to complete rewrites, tool or language conversions, and completely new content. Now you get to pick the things on the list that you can do within your constraints. As a side note, it's okay to be feeling a bit disappointed at this stage. It's very normal to have spent a bunch of time doing the research, realizing exactly how much better it could all be, researching the amazing things you could do to make it better, only to have to come crashing back to reality when you realize you can't possibly make it all happen. Mind you, from personal experience, I can tell you that if you do, by some miracle, get approval to implement everything you suggest, after the initial rush, you have to face the fact that you are about to embark on a massive project, and that can be incredibly overwhelming too. So perhaps there are no real winners in this game. Now that you have your implementation plan, I hate to say it, but you've got to do the hard yards and do the work. I have other talks on how to manage big projects like this, and I don't have time to go into it here. So if you do want to have a look at some more project management stuff for docs projects, take a look at this. If you scan this QR code, that will take you to one of my other videos. One final note that I want to make about this process is that it's important to measure your success. This starts right from the beginning. If you have done your planning properly, including things like your content analysis, then you have a good starting point for later on being able to measure how things have changed. It's also a great idea if you have the ability to be collecting data wherever possible, especially if you can start before you implement changes. That gives you a baseline for measuring change. For example, If you define early on that one of your measures of success is going to be improving dwell time on each page, you need to know what your average dwell time was before you started, so you can measure the improvement after your changes. And a final caveat is that you might need to be prepared to have your ideas challenged. It's entirely possible that even after all this research and planning, you implement a new design and it just sucks. Design and architecture is more art than science. After all, this building won an architecture award. Sometimes you try things out and it just doesn't hit. In that case, the most important thing you can do is listen to what your readers are telling you, either directly through feedback or indirectly through their actions on your site. Tweak things, roll things back if you have to, adjust as you go, and keep gathering data. Unlike buildings, documentation architecture is constantly a work in progress. And that brings us to the end. I just wanted to say that I work for an awesome company that lets me work on really cool stuff like this. So if that's something that sounds like it might be interesting to you, then you're in luck because we're hiring. And on that note, thanks for listening, be kind to each other, and I'll catch you live in the Q&A after this.
Let's begin with a question from Anna Karina. For the user/task analysis, suppose you don't have a lot of data. How do you guess where to start?
Well, I would say that that's pretty much how you do the user task analysis. If you're going out and getting a huge amount of data, then you're probably spending too much time on it. You don't want to spend that much time on it. And that's why I just recommend coming up with your top 3 users, try to get a beginner, an intermediate, and advanced. And then you can go and ask them questions if they're easily available. And you don't have a good understanding of what they do, or you can just make some assumptions. The first thing they would usually do is try to install the thing. After that, they're probably trying to do some initial setup, whatever it is that your software manages. So in in software at least, I got distracted by the chat. In software at least, it's usually pretty straightforward. I suspect though, with most things, you can make those assumptions at who your top 3 are, what's the top 5 things they want to do, and go from there. It is a rough tool. It's not a precision instrument by any means.
Okay. Next, we have a question from Marta. How should we manage this user/task approach if we don't write about products, but we write software projects docs or other docs that are not necessarily product related? For example, software logic, project management. I guess you could also include things like programming languages, frameworks, maybe. So does that make sense? Did I distill that question enough?
Yeah, it's interesting how all the questions always come up about the user task analysis. I think it's somehow it makes people brains fire. I would say I would hark back to one of the first things I said is that not all your readers are users, not all your users are readers. Whoever's reading your documentation is the person that you need to be writing for, and that's who you're doing the user task analysis for. So it's not necessarily a user of your product, software, code, tool, whatever it is. It's the person who is reading your documentation. That could be a C-suite executive. It could be someone who's just looking to know if they want to join your community. It could be a marketing person. It could be a finance guy trying to work out if they should spend money on it. They're not necessarily ever going to use whatever it is you're documenting. They're just reading the stuff that you're writing. So you need to make your user task analysis for them.
Okay. I have a question from Jadwiga, or maybe Jadwiga. I'm not entirely sure where they're from. Hi, Lana. I'll proxy that. What is the tool that you're using at Timescale? You said you flattened the hierarchy. So how deep or nested was it before you changed, and how is it now? I assume that means the hierarchy of the documentation or the hierarchy of the company.
I'll pick you up there. You've said flattened as in past tense. It's actually more like future tense.
Okay.
It is in the process of being flattened. As far as deep, I think it goes maybe up to 5 levels deep in some places. What's the question about the tool? The actual tool, we're writing in plain and simple Markdown, and we're using Gatsby as static site generator with a whole bunch of custom scripts in the middle, which is a little bit messy in some ways.
Bold.
It's bold. It's definitely a bold decision. That decision time with Timescale. So I didn't have any any sway in that, but that may change in the future as we move further forward. But yeah, in terms of tools, it's just plain and simple Markdown at this point.
Okay. And in terms of flattening, I'm guessing that's referring to the navigational hierarchy.
Yeah, so it's it is very hierarchical, the docs, and as I said in the talk, that was something that I found, it just made it difficult to find things. It was okay if you knew what the name for something was. We have these custom words that we use for things. We've sort of invented these features, and so we've had to call them stuff, right? But those words mean something to us, and they don't necessarily mean something to other people. So we know what a hypertable is, and we can write all about hypertables. But if you don't know what a hypertable is, you just know you need something that's like a Postgres table, but kind of different. It's a little harder to find that information. So we
do not know
needed
what
to.
You mean. Custom
That's my point. when we're using these words that we've invented, we need to make sure people can actually find that content, even though they don't know what those words are.
Yep. Okay. A question from Laura. When looking at the big picture, is it better to organize by task, by role, or by both?
Oh, how do you? Oh, by role, like I guess you mean by
the
users.
Reader, maybe? Yeah.
Like if you're system admin or end user or something. No, I would definitely go by task. Think about what your reader is doing, not about who they are. You probably already know, if you think about it, people are really good at miscategorizing themselves. Just because it says system administrator on their business card doesn't necessarily mean they're doing what every other system administrator does. They could be doing more or less programming. They could be doing more or less hardware stuff. They could be doing more or less talking to customers. So just use really inefficient way of categorizing stuff. I've had experiences where I've tried to organize stuff. I say, oh, I'm a developer looking for this content. It doesn't work. People never know what to click on. So no, I would always go by task. People know what they want to do. They don't necessarily know what role they think or we think they fit into.
Yep. I have two questions here from Mano and Sasha, which I'm going to kind of mush together, I think, because I think they're sort of related. So this is around feedback. So how you've worked a lot on design to try and make something as usable as possible to a reader. Or doesn't feel quite right to say readable in this case, but but it's still not quite right. So how do you know that? How do you get the feedback, and how do you process that feedback from, I suppose, various stakeholders, but ideally the readers?
So yeah, we did implement I just saw that you mentioned the feedback button in that comment. We did implement the feedback button. They're pretty useless on their own. It gives you a good feeling if you get more thumbs up than thumbs down, of course. Obviously, if you get a lot of thumbs down, it gives you something to work on, but it's hard to know what people don't like about stuff. So yeah, that on its own is not particularly useful. I find it's useful in amongst everything else. You've got to get a little bit of information from lots of different places. So we have that. We have mechanisms, because we're open source, we have ways for people to raise issues and to talk to us directly and to make edits against our docs. We also have a community around our product, a Slack channel anyone can join and come ask questions. And so docs questions obviously filter through there as well. And obviously just through our normal support channels as well. We're developing processes, it's a relatively new company, where support can see the questions that they're getting a lot. They can update the documentation, therefore we help reduce support's workload. So it's about getting all those different levels of feedback. And of course, just looking at the stats. We can see which pages people are hit, how much time people spend on each page, what their pathways are like. We also, I think I demonstrated the related content. We can see if people are clicking on those related content buttons, which ones they're more likely to click on, which tags they click on more, that kind of stuff. So we've sort of got that passive feedback as well as the active stuff that's actually coming to us as well.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'm going to have two requests. One is from you, Lana, because you've had a few people asking this. If you don't mind, maybe just put in the chat how people can contact you if they have any more questions. Or if you...
Yes, Twitter is good.
Okay.
You can find me on LinkedIn as well, but that's about the limit of my social media.
I think that's pretty good.
Otherwise, you can email me. Hold on.
Whilst
If
you're
I
doing
could
that,
type, oh my gosh, if I could type, I'd be dangerous.
it's probably
There you
quite
go.
late over there. It's fine. Okay, so
Too
just
late,
another
really.
another quick reminder. I won't promise half an hour of me talking instead of lightning talks, because maybe people want that. So instead, there will be half an hour of silence whilst I stare disapprovingly at you all if you don't submit lightning talks. So if you scroll up, you'll see a link from Andrea. Go and submit some lightning talks there. And we'll take another quick 8-minute break. And at 12:20 Central European time, we'll be Ryan Macklin with "So You Need to Give Bad News to Users, ... So that sounds intriguing. See you over on the main stage in, a few minutes. So thanks very much again, Lana.
Thank you, Lana.
See ya.